Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's ASUG webcast. My name is Kelsey Gould, and I'm on the Enterprise Content team here at ASUG, and I will be your moderator for this event. I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to join us for this presentation. Some quick notes before we get started. For the best viewing experience, we recommend closing any programs or browser sessions running in the background. You can find answers to some common technical issues located in the Help Engagement tool at the bottom of your screen. You can submit your questions at any time by using the Q&A widget on your console or by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to as many as we can during our Q&A with the speakers at the end of the presentation. Today's webcast is being recorded, and the link to the recording will be distributed in a follow-up email tomorrow along with the slide decks to the presentation. And make sure to check out more relevant content with the links in the resource widget. And lastly, before you leave today, we'd appreciate if you could take a minute or two to fill out our webcast survey. The speakers and ASUG would really appreciate your feedback. And that's all from me. Today's webcast is SAP GTS U.S. Foreign Trade Zone, Lessons from Ropaar and Dorel Sports after a year running 3 zones. Our speakers today are Jitendra Singh, Practice Director at Ropaar, and Mark Mulvey, SAP Systems Analyst at Dorel Sports. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jitendra to get us started today.
Thank you, Kelsey. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session on foreign trade zones with Ropaar and Dorel Consulting. Thanks for taking the time today. The objective of the session is to essentially share the lessons learned from Dorel's implementation of foreign trade zone solution from SAP GTS using SAP GTS. Share the key milestones, the key learnings, and essentially leave you at the end of this session, hopefully with better informed and with a better understanding of what's involved in doing the implementation, and also give a high level of the actual process of setting up a foreign trade zone. So my name is Jitendra Singh. I'm the Practice Director for Ropaar. With me is our customer, representing our customer, Dorel Sports, Mark Mulvey. Mark, would you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Mark Mulvey. I am an SAP analyst with Dorel Sports. I did work with Jitendra when we went live with GTS, so I do look forward to talking with you today.
Thank you. So over the course of the next 35 to 40 minutes or so, we're going to cover obviously an introduction of ourselves, basically our companies, our respective companies, give a summary of the project, show you the timeline, what it took, what was the effort, what were the steps in setting up the FTZ and going live with it, share some key decisions and lessons learned along the way, and of course, share with you what's been the progress since the go live in terms of what kind of issues have happened since then. What are the changes that have occurred since the go live, which happened in July or August of 2019. So it's been about a year, and a lot has changed since then. The whole idea for the road ahead is to give you an understanding of what to expect once you're live, to give you a better understanding of the total cost of ownership of the solution, and of course leave some time in the end for Q&A. Mark.
Yeah, the company that I work for is Dorel Sports. So we are a division of Dorel Industries. Our main business is bicycles. We do get into some performance apparel, jogging strollers, and ride-on toys also. You probably, if you have a bike, most of you probably heard of us because you can see some of our major brands down there. Or Cannondale, Mongoose, Schwinn, GT. We own a lot of the major brands. Now, as far as Dorel Sports, we have companies in our division specifically. We have plants in many different parts of the world, but the one we'll be focusing on today are the 3 locations in the U.S. And basically what we do is our company is mainly importing and bikes from China or Taiwan and bringing it into 3 facilities in the U.S. so you can see if we're importing how this could be a big benefit to us. Okay, Sandra.
All right, and we're going to go into those benefits and how you went about it in a minute. So a little bit about ourselves. We're a global trade and transportation focused company. We're an SAP services company. We're also a North America services partner with SAP. But we do have a global footprint in terms of our project fulfillment. So we service our clients obviously from the US, but we also have offshore development and support capacity to provide blended cost models for implementing our projects. Some of our key areas of focus over the years have been, obviously global trade services, S4 international trade, transportation management, and enterprise warehouse management. So we've been in existence since 2010, so we're going on 10 years. And over the course of these years, the key capabilities we've developed over time has been focused around self-filing of imports and exports to customs in the US, Canada, Great Britain. We have a few firsts to our credit in this industry. The first one is, of course, the first ACE implementation with self-filing using Global Trade Services, which went live in 2017. And of course, the first distribution foreign trade zone implementation in 2019, which is the subject of our webcast today. So related capabilities include, integrating SAP GTS with non-SAP ERP systems. We're basically EDI connecting brokers and freight forwarders, special customs procedures, so the equivalent or similar to foreign trade zones, special programs which are available in the EU, such as processing under customs control, OPR, IPR, etc. And finally, but not the least, obviously working with free trade agreements as well. So enough about us. Let's move on to the project summary. Essentially, in this section, we're going to cover the timeline, the milestones, the key steps that were involved in the project, what was the effort involved, and how long it took. However, before we go into that directly, what we wanted to do was at least have a slide or two, spend a couple of minutes over exactly what an FTZ is, to level set and to dovetail into our subsequent slides. So at a very minimal level, foreign trade zone are basically specially designated locations by the FTZ board where merchandise can be brought in duty-free. So before you actually enter the goods for consumption into U.S. commerce. So the difference with bonded warehouse, and one of the advantages of an FTZ is that there is no time limit. So you can, once the goods are brought in, as long as the FTZ is active, there is no urgency to get those goods out and then release them into commerce. Both domestic sourced goods and foreign goods can commingle. So you're basically controlling inventory at a logical level, not at the physical level. And it's possible to do a wide range of manufacturing activities as well. So not the subject of today's webcast, because it's focused on the distribution of FTZs, but there are some advantages, obviously, to manufacturing as well. So what exactly are the benefits? The benefits are around duty deferral. So because you're entering goods only when you need them to be released into commerce in the US, so you gain whatever the time frame is. So in case of Dorel, that happened to be months before goods that were brought in, stocked in the DCs, and ultimately released or shipped to their retailers. There was a long time gap, and that was one of the main benefits of achieving duty deferral. Duty elimination, especially in cases where the goods are actually exported out of the FTZ, there are no duties paid because they never were in the first place when you brought them into the FTZ. The manufacturing FTZs have another advantage if it's applicable to your product lines, a possibility to take advantage of inverted tariff. So essentially, goods, the components are subject to a higher rate, but the finished good that you transform into in the FTZ is subject to a lower tariff duty rate. In those scenarios, you can actually bring your components duty free and pay only the lower duty rate of the finished product when you actually release it into commerce. Not insignificant is the customs fee reduction around the merchandise processing fees. So these are fees payable on an entry-by-entry basis. One of the advantages of an FTZ is you do weekly entries of consumption, which means no matter how many times in a week you ship out goods from an FTZ, you declare them all together in one shot, in one weekly entry, which means you're only subject to one MPF on that one single entry. And of course, because goods, foreign trade zones are essentially federal sites, they are not considered as part of the United States commerce zone. Your goods are also not subject to any kind of inventory taxes as well, as long as they are in the FTZ. Just to talk about the MPF just a little bit, because that was one of the two main advantages that was a factor in Dorel going in for a foreign trade zone, was the reduction in merchandise processing fees. So in a few slides down, Mark is going to share some statistics specific to Dorel around the number of containers and number of entries that they had to file. And that would probably give you a little more appreciation of why this was a big deal as well, in addition to the deferral of duties and the attendant cash flow advantages. So in this example, we just, these numbers are not Dorel's numbers. We're just giving them for illustration purposes. So for example, if you have 20 shipments a week, if you are declaring goods at the border, you have 20 entries, all of them subject to, let's say, a maximum of 528, which means a total MPF tab of $10,000, for example. Replace that with a single entry and the attendant MPF on that single weekly entry of $528. So these, it's not an insignificant reason and part of your calculus when you are trying to do a cost-benefit analysis of establishing a foreign trade zone. Okay, so now let's go into how Dorel went about building the business case for their foreign trade zone. So there were basically four main pillars or category of costs and reasons that they considered while building the business case, and the central pillar among them being the trade costs. So the imports for Dorel were subject to high tariffs, or are subject to high tariffs, including the imposition of Section 301 duties for imports, and the time lag between the import and release into commerce and shipping to a retailer was significant enough that these trade costs essentially put an undue burden on their business, and that became one of the main reasons for going in for a foreign trade zone and undertaking this project as well. So obviously, MPF cost reduction was a factor as well, part of the calculus, and the brokerage cost reduction because of the nature of SAP GTS, which is built for a self-filing model. In other words, eliminating the need for a broker to manage your FTZ filings and processes. So being a self-filer, the savings on brokerage costs was almost a cherry on top in terms of building the business case. Some of the non-monetary reasons, but reasons nonetheless, were around manual efforts in terms of constantly checking the work of the broker, communicating with carriers and brokers when they were clearing goods at the border, replacing that obviously with GTS with self-filing, correcting entries, feeding the right data to the brokers to be able to make entry at the border. All involved manual efforts that took away from other activities that Dorel personnel could undertake. So all these resulted in increase in working capital, trade costs obviously being the biggest reason among them. And then, of course, the possibility of delayed shipments because of border controls. So at the end of the day, based on all those, for all those reasons, Dorel was able to make a cost-benefit analysis and go ahead with the project and see the return on investment that they would make by undertaking the move to foreign trade zones. So in this slide, what we wanted to do was at least leave you with, at a very high level, what are the steps in the process of setting up an FTZ. So not just implementing Global Trade Services as an ICRS, an inventory control system, but what were the main steps that Dorel had to undertake in the process of setting up an FTZ and ultimately going live with it. So it started with doing a feasibility study, part of which I alluded to in the previous slide, which was doing a cost-benefit analysis, seeing where their main trade costs are, what would be the benefits. Then looking at the facilities or the distribution centers, the existing distribution centers that they had, to see what kind of readiness they had for an FTZ. So FTZs are essentially federal sites. So any wrongdoing and crime that's committed is a federal crime on those sites. So all personnel needed to be background checked. The involvement of HR was important in this first step, as well as towards the end of it when Dorel went to CBP to get final approval for activation. So the next step in the process was essentially working with the grantees, the three grantees in the regions where their three DCs are located, and we're going to show that in the subsequent slides. That they have three distribution centers located in 3 time zones altogether in the U.S. Under 3 different grantees. So Dorel had to essentially work with the grantees to prepare the application, submit a draft of those applications to the FTZ board, receive comments, make the adjustments that were needed on those applications, and submit them for final, after finalizing those applications with them. So Dorel used what's a streamlined process called the Alternative Site Framework to get their FTZ applications approved. And in this framework, you receive expedited approval within 30 days for setting up your foreign trade zones. The next step was the activation. This one, the applications were approved, which means Dorel had to go out and finalize their bonds, FTZ operator bonds. So, and that's a requirement because at the end of the day, the goods which are coming in are duty unpaid and they're not entered yet. They're only admitted into the zone. So customs requires that those goods and the attendant liability is basically covered by an operator's bond, which Dorel would purchase. So they had to conduct a background check of personnel at these sites and essentially start the process of activation, which means doing site visits with the CBP, showing them the entry-exit points, and then ultimately getting approval for the activation. The next step was, or the next block of activities was essentially the SAP GTS part of the project or the effort in implementing SAP GTS foreign trade zone as the ICRS, so as the inventory control and record keeping system, which is what CBP requires, that every foreign trade zone operator needs to have proper control over the inventory that's coming into the foreign trade zone, being transformed if it's a manufacturing zone, or otherwise controlled, as long as it's in the foreign trade zone and till the point that it actually leaves and enters U.S. commerce or is re-exported out. So in this slide, the progression of steps is not necessarily the exact sequence. There is some overlap in these steps. Some steps can start while the other ones are still in progress. But these are essentially a general sequence, and the main block of activities and steps that you need to undertake as you consider setting up a foreign trade zone in your respective companies. So in the next slide, we will show the overlap and the overlap aspect of these activities as well. Mark, do you want to take the next three?
Yeah, thanks, Jitendra. So we're gonna expand just a little bit upon what Jitendra said. And there are several main activity streams, and you can see a couple of them in this slide, that need to converge but can start independent of each other. The slide represents the timeline specifically at Dorel Sports. As you can see, the first stream of activity noted at the bottom, which is the FTZ application process, started approximately 2 months prior to the start of our GTS implementation. Okay. Of course, the cost benefit and the corporate strategy to use an FTZ started way before that, but month 2 is mainly when we started the main process. The second stream of activity is the SAP GTS, ICS-RS implementation, which started about 2 months after the application process. The third stream was the application of the ACE filing, letters of intent, which Jitendra noted just a little bit ago, getting our filer codes, setting up connections with, ACE, also getting our ACH statements set up for paying duties, and finally, for the FTZ process and the CBP search system for testing purposes. Now, what we did at Dorel Sports is we had 3 locations, which we'll show you here in a future slide. But we had an 8-month go live, or an 8-month go live for our first plant. We did do 2 staggered go lives after that, about 2 weeks apart for the additional 2 plants. Okay. And after that, we probably had about 2 months where we were stabilizing after go live, kind of making sure everything was running smooth. Postings were going in okay, inventory was okay. All those things were being double checked on a daily basis just to make sure things were okay. Now, on our next slide, what we're gonna this is just kind of a recap. So to summarize, basically our implementation was 8 months. We had a 2-month head start on the FTZ process, and we had about a 3-month process to set up with CDP and the ACE self-filing set up. Okay. And the FTZ process commenced 2 months after the project start, with the overlap after the start to receive our zone IDs. So there's several different things that we were getting set up, and I kind of mentioned them earlier, but I'm going to rattle off some of them. We have like an IOR number, an ACH payer unit number, a filer code number. We had to make sure our bonds were in place, operator and custodial. And just the firm's code, site ID numbers, all that were things we were setting up. Now, in the next slide here, it will show our current locations. We had 3 zones. We had 4 legal entities. We had 3 IORs, 3 ACE filer codes, but we had 8 plants. You may ask why we have 8 plants is we tend to keep broken up in sales organizations in SAP, and we tend to keep those separate plants in SAP. So that's why we have 8 plants. We also did about 400 E214s per month. All those are automatically sent through the GTS system. We have 9 containers on average, about 9 containers coming in a month. We've saved, several millions on the MPF savings per year. And one of the things that that was a big saver for us was cash flow savings. So, for example, if you need to borrow money to import and pay customs as these containers are coming in, that is now delayed, and you don't have to pay all that money until the product actually ships from the location. So that was a couple of the big savers for us. Okay, Jitendra. Jitendra, are you there?
Oops, I'm on mute. Thanks a lot, Mark. Thanks for covering those slides. So the next few slides, we're going to talk about the lessons learned. And in some cases, the main decisions that were taken, the processes that had to be changed because Dorel was moving from declaring goods at the border to now bringing everything into an FTZ, which caused changes to be made up and down their business processes. So supply chain changes, their HR, facilities changes, goods receiving changes, etc. So the next 3 slides are essentially a recap of those decisions, and hopefully at the end of it, you're better informed in terms of what you need to keep in mind and have them in the background, in the back of your head when you go about the same effort in establishing an FTZ in your environment. Okay, so this first slide, we're going to focus on the kind of logistics challenges that occurred in the course of the project and some of the design decisions that had to be made, which had an implication on the business processes, in how they're all operated and brought in product, as well as on the system itself, in terms of being able to facilitate the changed business processes. So in the category of shipping and transportation, I think one of the first challenges they had was, during the design decision, we discovered that Dorel had a practice of shipping warranty parts and finished products on a single bill of material, on a single bill of lading, and from a business strategy perspective, they wanted to keep all the warranty parts separate from finished products. So finished products were the only one meant for entering into or admitting into the foreign trade zone. So it was basically a legacy decision, and it was a function of their transportation optimization decisions. So if I'm building a container with bikes and there's some room left, I'm going to store in some warranty product itself. Obviously, this was fine as long as the goods were getting declared at the border. But with moving to an FTZ, that business process had to change. So you can't split a bill of lading and partially declare it at the border and the rest into an FTZ. That was the main constraint driving the decision. So changes had to be made upstream to prevent these instances from occurring. The other challenge we noticed during the design sessions was also basically maintaining the bonded movements from the port of import all the way to those 3 FTZs that Mark had shown in the last slide. So because these are duty unpaid goods meant for admission into an FTZ, they need to be bonded. And in case of Dorel, some of the supply chain moves were intermodal, and they involved multiple carriers, multiple providers along the way. One of the implications of that would have been opening and closing in transit movements or in bond movements at every handoff. So, rail carriers would hand off to the inland carrier, would hand off to the yard that actually holds the containers, and each carrier or each provider in that step would have had to open and close in bond movements. So in order to keep the same business flow without actually compromising on compliance, one of the decisions that Dorel had to make was to purchase their own transportation bond and essentially use that to cover the entire move from the port of import to the foreign trade zone. And that essentially took away the need for the multiple handoffs that happened along the way. And we'll share in a subsequent slide what that means from a system perspective, what had to change in order to allow that. So the third challenge was around handling of overflow of containers. So Dorel is a high volume operation. As Mark was saying, they handle about 900 containers a month. And especially during times of month end, quarter end, year end, there's a lot of volume that's running through the system, a lot of volume of product, a lot of containers coming in. The bottleneck then becomes the warehouse processes for receiving and unloading. And in those instances, there were situations where containers would back up and would have to be held at a yard, which would require that the yard be the yard where they're waiting for unloading for 24 to 48 hours would also have to be bonded as well. So the decision to go with their own transportation bond was another reason. This was another reason for doing that, to make sure that the transportation bond from Dorel basically covers the entire move, including those instances when the goods are waiting to be unloaded and into the foreign zone. So shipment diversions was another shipping and transportation process that needed to be done, that needed to be handled with moving to a foreign zone. So in the prior life, it was not an issue to once the goods are cleared at the border, if there are any kind of warehouse constraints to move from one DC to another, but with an FTZ and goods traveling inbound, Dorel has right now specific features to handle diversions. So in cases where the diversion is known and occurs after a permit to transfer is filed for moving the goods from port of import to the foreign trade zone, basically had a procedure for canceling canceling the PTP and then doing an IT movement of those goods to the new location. In other cases, they had to write down procedures to make sure, even if it's a diversion, to first receive it into the intended foreign trade zone and then immediately release them into commerce for basically shipping to the alternative location. The second category of logistics challenges were basically around facilities, all of these measures, and of course personnel at those facilities as well. All these measures were part of the FTZ designation, and they were subject to approval from CBP. So clearly demarcating the entire facility as a zone, And in case of Dorel, in some instances, they could not because they wanted to keep some areas separate within the facility for non-FTZ related activities, which were not going to be performed inside the foreign trade zone. So minor repair assemblies are still performed outside of the FTZ zone, but within the same facility as well. Controlling the entry exits, securing, like I said before, these are federal sites and they're holding duty unpaid goods. So signage, good signage, lighting, security cameras, all these were changes, physical changes that had to be performed before getting the activation approval from CBP. On the warehousing side, part of the logistics challenges were essentially taking care of writing down procedures for handling overships and underships to account for any kind of variances that happen once goods are unloaded and Dorel becomes aware of them. So in the past, Dorel would post the inventory adjustments with a relaxed timeline because the goods were duty paid. However, with the FTZ timeframes tighten up, the warehouse processes have to make adjustments as soon as they are discovered. For example, creating an admission without reference to a waybill to account for any kind of overship quantities. Same thing for the cycle counting processes as well. So in a prior life, negative or positive differences in a cycle count could be adjusted and accounted for in the warehouse without any customs implications. Obviously, that's not the case in an FTZ. So they had to basically institute a little more rigor into how they work. So a good example of this was basically, if they are doing cycle counts and there are some missing bikes in the DC, they would be posted in as a positive difference. In an FTZ, that would mean they would be duty paid. They would be declared as an entry and duty paid. However, when those missing bikes were discovered at some later date, they would be admitted again and then duty paid a second time on the same set of bikes. So one of the, I'm underscoring the word discipline here. One of the changes that Dorel to make in their processes was develop a documented process where warehouse and finance would have to sign off on any kind of cycle count, discrepancies that were discovered in the warehouse in the foreign trade zone. So the next category of challenges were around the FTZ approval and activation. So the first one among them being, since FTZs are owned and operated by a legal entity, at the outset, CBP did not approve a direct delivery privilege. As Mark noted in the previous slide, there are 3 different IORs with goods coming in for all 3 of them into each one of those foreign trade zone, but the operator and the operating bond is held by one single legal entity. So because of that complication, direct delivery privilege in some cases was not given. And what that means is this required a regular admission at the border with on the basis of an invoice or the ASN, as opposed to doing a direct delivery where you're just declaring piece count at the border and actual tariff quantities once they are received, which is a simplification from a foreign trade zone perspective. Obviously, if you're declaring based on declaring tariff quantities at the border, there are higher chances of discovering discrepancies once you unload and you actually receive product in the warehouse. One of the other challenges was around securing transportation bond. That was something that wasn't planned from the beginning, but as we went to do the design, and especially the design discussions from the ICRS, this was a common theme in terms of, the need to go in for a transportation bond for covering the goods in transit to the FTZ, which normally is a carrier function handled by a carrier. So the other business challenges was around FTZ operations and personnel. Essentially, Dorel needed to operate three different zones and three different foreign trade zones in 3 different time zones, and in the end, they're doing it with 2 full-time personnel who are responsible for all filing all permit to transfers, opening and closing in bond movements, filing admission, E-214s, doing the weekly entries for all those 900 containers a month. And all of this was possible because of upskilling and training of trade compliance personnel. So one of the things we haven't spoken about so far is that Dorel came from a broker environment, so they were not used to self-filing, number one. Number two, trade compliance was almost a part-time function within the organization, with the majority of heavy lifting being done by the brokers. So it was quite a change in their thinking in terms of doing self-filing and operating a foreign trade zone or 3 foreign trade zones themselves, and doing it over the span of time that ultimately we were able to achieve was possible because of this upskilling and the trade and the training that was provided to the trade compliance personnel. So training on FTZ processes, basically ACE self-filing was another thing that was new to Dorel. Normally, brokers would take care of any kind of PGA requirements. Although Dorel's products are not subject to a lot of PGAs, but the few that were essentially just taken care of by the brokers in the past life. Going forward, the personnel taking care of FTZ operations had to manage that as well. And then finally, the challenge was around training and updating warehouse procedures, making all those procedures to manage variances, cycle counts, destruction, anything that touches the inventory that's duty unpaid in that foreign trade zone. So one of the business process changes that they had to make was because of space constraints in their FTZs. So around peak times, there's a need to do an inventory balance, which means some inventory needs to be moved from one FTZ or warehouse to another. So in the prior world, that was not a problem because the goods were already duty paid, but they had an implication in after the setup of FTZs, in order to preserve those benefits, at least on the inventory that was moved from one zone to another. We needed to do a zone-to-zone movement, which at the time of go live was not really supported by the SAP GTS solution. It is now, but not at that point in time. So business procedures had to be developed to essentially, in the interest of managing the space in the warehouse, basically declare those goods on the weekly entry and then move them duty paid to the other zone. The second business process was around just managing goods that were still going to be cleared at the border versus those meant for admission to the FTZ. The challenge there was to make sure that that Dorel had a process to ensure that inventory cleared at the border does not get posted as unpaid, duty unpaid inventory in the FTZ. And this is going to have, this had a system impact on the ICRS, and one of the challenges that we had to solve on the implementation. Okay, so the next set of challenges are the actual technical challenges we had to undergo or solve as a part of the SAP GTS implementation in this whole process of setting up the FTZ. So as Mark explained, they have multiple importer record numbers and also multiple filer codes which are operating in the same zone. That was a challenge that we had to solve within the SAP GTS structure to be able to determine and use the right importer record and the right filer code for each import or each admission document and the weekly entry that we're producing in the foreign trade zone. As Mark was showing in the previous slide, they have 3 filer codes, which basically resulted in 3 weekly entries every week for each one of those importer record numbers. Treatment of legacy goods movements. So one of the main design decisions was how to disposition each goods movement that's happening in the warehouse. So the background for this is the fact that Dorel is an old ECC implementation. So organically over time, they've developed or enhanced some goods movements for different purposes to serve different purposes in their warehouses. Each one of those goods movements had an implication on the inventory in the foreign trade zone. So one of our challenges was to basically disposition each one of those goods movements, determine their meaning if we could definitively, or set them up as unknown goods movement, which would require the FTZ operators to take a decision on those unknown goods movements in GTS themselves. So they would normally look at what was the intent, what was the what actually happened in the warehouse with those unknown goods movements, and then basically treat them as a negative or a positive to the inventory, with the ultimate implication being, do they end up as an admission or they end up on the weekly entry as a consumption. Waybill creation based on ASNs and bill of ladings. So the standard process in SAP GTS uses the waybill document in GTS as this first step in the process for doing an admission document, and then ultimately the weekly entry as well. So the standard process assumes that a human by hand would create a waybill, but considering the high volume operation and the lean staffing of the FTZ operation, this wasn't something that would be manageable with someone having to hand key all the bill of and create the waybill documents. So one of the things that we had to do on the project was essentially set up the waybill creation process to be automatic based on bill of lading numbers and the ASNs that are received in their ERP system, in the ECC system. Bridging the gap in standard GTS for PGA data. So Global Trade Services as a solution has the framework for managing PGA data, and a framework for declaring PGA data to ACE, so other partner government agency data, in the ACE filings. For Dorel, that means primarily EPA and NHTSA DOT data declared on their weekly entries. But from a project perspective, that means we had to enhance the framework because that's the expectation from GTS, is that whatever industry-specific requirement or PGA data that you need for your specific class of products and your specific aegis codes, you would solve that on the project itself, utilizing the framework that's already there. Opening of inbound movements for goods in transit to the FTZ. So we explained the business reasons for it. The system implication for that was, as a solution, GTS is set up for closing the transit or closing the inbound movements once goods arrive at the FTZ. The underlying assumption being that the opening of the inbound movements will be done by the carrier. In case of Dorel, and on this specific project, as we explained before, Dorel needed to open the inbound movement themselves and act as a carrier would, and essentially transport the goods under their own transportation bond. So we had to enhance the GTS inbound process to be able to open the inbound movements as well, in addition to closing them, which was already there. And of course, the ACE filing component of opening that inbound movement as well. Finalizing data sources for the weekly FTZ forecast. And so one of the main elements in FTZ operations is the forecast document. It is essentially a forecast of how many units or how many quantities you intend to put on the weekly entry. So it's sent a week in advance of the actual weekly entry. On the project itself, one of the main design decisions was finalizing exactly what would be the data sources for building that FTZ forecast. The idea is to be as accurate as possible. So in order to minimize the need to submit any kind of supplementary forecast, so if you are predicting or you're forecasting a weekly consumption of 100 units, and you end up actually consuming 120 because of a rush order from a retailer, for example, you're trying to minimize those instances where a supplemental forecast also needs to be submitted. Because you in the process itself, you cannot consume more than what you forecast, necessitating supplement to the original forecast. One of the other challenges was around essentially the cutover of existing duty paid inventory at go live. So the assumption there is obviously at go live, everything is duty paid, and because it was cleared at the border. But during go live itself, before you can actually start FTZ operations in GTS, you have to transfer all that inventory as duty paid, which basically takes a fair bit of time, essentially marking all the products as relevant for FTZ, then transferring the duty paid data, and during that process, having a blackout for any kind of goods movement being posted while that process was in progress. So that was the end of the technical challenges and decisions that we had to undergo on the project. I'm going to briefly talk about the road ahead, what's happened since. So as Mark was mentioning, the first facility, the first foreign trade zone went live in July-August timeframe 2019. In 2-week increments, the subsequent 2 facilities went live as well, followed by a 2-month stabilization period. The amount of time it took to essentially go into normal operations where you're just dealing with exception situations. Since then, what's changed is because you're a self-filer, what you have to do and what the SAP GTS solution needs to do is to keep pace with any kind of regulatory changes or any kind of ACE system changes that CBP rolls out along the way. And one of the main changes has been around implementing FTZ 214 what CBP calls phase 2 changes, which is corrections to a permit to transfer, which wasn't possible, and posting admission corrections as well. So new functionality that definitely makes the life of a foreign trade zone operator a lot easier in terms of being able to adjust to changes that might or corrections that might be needed to a permit to transfer, as well as to admissions. So these changes went live in September, and they're actually already in production at Dorel. The second bullet point here is for the document imaging system rollout. So far, Dorel has been, in case of request for document production from CBP, has been sending those documents out through the email mechanism, but ultimately they need to move to what's called the document imaging system. It's a facility from CBP where you send either unsolicited or, in case of request from CBP, any kind of documents that support the admission or the entry that you're filing. So that could be invoices directly from the system. So not through an email, but through actual EDI messages that submit the PDFs of the requested documents to the CBP inspector that's looking at your entries. The road ahead also includes implementing the zone-to-zone transfer between DCs. So as I explained above, to account for this functionality being missing at the time of go live, Dorel had to document and set up procedures to basically, in instances where inventory needs to be moved from one DC to another, which would involve a zone-to-zone movement, they had to actually declare them duty paid, put them on a weekly entry in the source zone, and then receive them as duty paid goods into the destination DC. The road ahead is obviously to implement zone-to-zone transfer so they can preserve the benefits of duty deferral as long as they can, even on those goods which are moved from one DC to another. So we're also adding statement update, which basically lets you put the payment of weekly entries, lets you move the payment of weekly entries from one date to another in order to account for any changes that might have occurred that would basically delay the payment of duties through the ACH process to CBP. The road ahead is obviously also getting more entitlement out of doing analysis on the data that's the year's worth and now more of data that's there in the FTZ to, for example, do the duty owed report for finance. So things that finance would want to know ahead of time. What are they on the hook for, even though they're not paying duties right away, but what would be the liabilities for them? And of course, improve upstream business processes, look at the data quality that's there in their ERP system. And then ultimately partner with Ropaar, which is a partnership we have with Dorel in keeping them up to date and assisting them as CBP rolls out changes in the processes. Okay, we're ready for Q&A. Not too much time left, but we'll try to take as many as we can. Let me see.
Yep, we have time for just a couple of questions, so we'll get through at least a couple, and if we don't get to your question or the question requires follow-up, we'll make sure that you and the speakers get in touch. First question, in Dorel's experience, would it make sense to go live with the 3 foreign trade zones at different times, or would it have been feasible to go live with all 3 at the exact same time?
We could have went live with all 3, but we found it easier on our team to go live and monitor the inventory and make sure everything was running okay. We did it mainly as a safety precaution, and it just worked out well for us doing it that way.
Great, thank you. Did GTS support all the movement types out of the box?
That's a good question. The answer is no, it did not. There are a couple that catch my attention. One is plant to plant, and another one is material to material movements. Most all the other ones, I would say about 98 to 99% of the movements were there. That is the 2 that got us at the beginning. So when we don't just do a plant to plant anymore. We have to do an STO and move it from one facility to another. But in doing that, we lose the benefit of the duty deferral, like Jitendra just mentioned. But the majority of them were there. It was just a couple.
All right, thank you. Unfortunately, we're out of time for more questions. So before I wrap up today, Jitendra, Mark, anything you would like to say in summary?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, let me give you a couple just real quick. The first of all, if we were like the second ones to go live with GTS, when you go live, make sure you're going live with the newest system and the newest service packs. That will help you a lot, okay? In addition to that, every step of the way, we had training documents, and we wrote them down, and our people knew exactly at this point in this step, this is what you enter. So that was probably one of the biggest benefits we did, is we created training documents the whole way, and they knew every step they needed to do. And in addition, keep up to date, look like getting U.S. Customs Daily Digest. Keep up to date on what Customs is changing, because SAP is watching that and they're making changes with it. So for example, phase 2, when that went live, SAP had already made the changes, and we just needed to implement the notes and go live. So those are just kind of some things to keep an eye on and keep up to date on.
Right, and if I can just add a little bit to it, I think overall, the process definitely was a little challenging at times, but considering that they all came from almost very minimal trade compliance experience and definitely no ACE filing or FTZ operation experience, it's quite remarkable. Putting in the work. We were able to actually go live in a space of about 8 to 9 months, and then stabilize 2 months after that with 3 zones. And to date, they're still operating with 2 FTEs, these 3 zones remotely. And considering they're a high volume operation, I think that was one of the biggest learnings for us, that going in, that was one of the things you hear about FTZs is they're just too onerous. And if you're adding self-filing to that, that makes them almost impractical. Dorel is proof positive that it can be done and it's doable. Thank you. I think that's all I had.
All right. Thank you so much again to our speakers for a great webcast. And on behalf of ASUG, I'd like to thank Ropaar as well as everyone who took the time today to attend. And this webcast has been open to non-ASUG members as well as to ASUG members. So if this happened to be your first time at an ASUG event, just want to say welcome and thank you for coming. And as mentioned before, the recording of today's program will be distributed in a follow-up email tomorrow along with the slide deck from the presentation. Please take a moment to complete the survey on the right of your console or by clicking on the survey engagement tool at the bottom of your screen. We would really appreciate your feedback. And with that, I will close today's webcast. Have a great day, everyone.